Hello everybody, Kite562 here with another audio review for y'all of You Like It Darker by Stephen King, so be sure to leave a like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed the content on this channel. I'm your host Kite562 of Kite562 Books and Manga Reviews, and here's my audio review of You Like It Darker by Stephen King on this Friday at 6 p.m. like I said I would in my community post, and it's a lot less windy so I can actually get this recorded, so sit back and relax and listen to what I have to say about You Like It Darker by Stephen King, and I'll be putting chapters for all 13 parts of this review, so I hope you all enjoy that and appreciate that. So sit back and relax and listen to what I have to say about You Like It Darker by Stephen King. Story 1, Two Talented Bastids. So for the plot of this story, as Mark Carmody talks to Ruth Crawford off the record about his late father's success as a writer, along with his father's friend who was like an uncle to Mark, he tells Ruth about a mysterious incident that happened in November of 1978. So starting off, with this story, it really has an eerie supernatural mystery feel to it. Within the first 15 pages out of 60, the story has its hooks in me as all of the information is revealed. Also, this Carmody family, are they related to Mrs. Carmody from the Mist novella story in The Skeleton Crew? So I'll leave a link to the top of that review as well in this audio review. So again, is Miss Carmody related to the Mrs. Carmody from the Skeleton Crew, or is this just pure coincidence? And I have to say, my favorite quote from this story is, "Loyalty, trustworthiness, they come to the same, I suppose, or almost. Men are lucky to have even one good friend. Women, I suspect, have more, but you know better I." Laird Carmody, Two Talented Bastids, page 17, You Like It Darker by Stephen King. So continuing on, the first chapter of this story is still going very strong, even reaching page 30. I love the scene where Mark opened the drawer of his late father and read one of the notebooks hidden within. I'm really struggling figuring out the twist here. However, that's a good thing in this part of this first story. And so for my final thoughts on story 1 of Two Talented Bastids, this was a really sweet starting point of this collection of stories in You Like It Darker. The love that Mark has for his father when he passed at the age of 90, I also loved the flashbacks of Butch and Laird, I really don't know how you're supposed to pronounce this name here, in the woods of November 1978. Again, this story was a really strong start to this collection. So with that said, on to story 2, The Fifth Step. So for the plot of this story, Harold Jameson crosses paths with a man in a hoodie named Jack, who's been a sober alcoholic for only a few months. Jack tries to pay Harold for Harold's time to hear him out. The two men decide to have a little discussion at a bench. And so for the first side note, I only read the first 2 pages of Jack's experiences in Alcoholics Anonymous. Is what's keeping me interested in this story. Will this conversation with Harold change both of their lives for the better or for the worst? And so for my final thoughts on this story really impressed me with how it played out. For the story itself was only 10 pages, it really hooked me in with just a simple conversation with a stranger on hard times. Both of these stories are favorites of mine with how varied they are, and again, I highly recommend you read this whole story collection. It's absolutely fantastic in my opinion, so definitely give You Like It Darker a try. You'll hear that a lot in this audio review. So with that said, on with story number 3, Willie the Weirdo. So for the plot of story 3, a family is trying to prepare for the worst. As the family is in the middle of a pandemic, James Jonas Fielder is enjoying the last moments of his life with his grandson Willie. I have to say, for the first side note, I absolutely despise Willie's older sister Roxy. She's just a total dick to Willie just because he's just a little different. And he also might be of special needs as well. So even at one point, the story points out that the endless bullying doesn't even stop at home, which is very heartbreaking in my opinion. And so continuing on, with Roxy, she even stated that if she were to have a kid and it ended up like Willie, she would have leave him in the middle of the woods. I mean, this character Roxy, I feel like there are no redeeming qualities for her in the future. Also, with the COVID pandemic going on within this story, that is another set of flashbacks for me. However, Willie's fascination with death does seem concerning. Even Roxy comments to her mother mother that Willie may end up being a serial killer when he's older. And for the record, in the story, Willie's just 10 and Roxy's 12, sadly. So she's kind of letting the older sibling power trip go to her head. Again, that's just my opinion. And so continuing on, I loved how varied these stories are that I've read so far in this collection. From the settings, themes, and genres, with only the first 3 stories read in You Like It Darker, shows just how sharp Mr. King's writing style is. However, I will say this about Willie's family. It does seem they have given up hope for a bright future for themselves and put Willie inadvertently in their crosshairs emotionally, and that's how I'm interpreting the story. And so for my final thoughts, another short and to the point story, very well written and really captured the feeling of a chaotic family in the middle of a global pandemic. Again, some of these stories take place during COVID, so continuing on, I do hope this story does get a prequel of some sort, more focusing on the grandfather's younger years, which, if you haven't read this story, it really caught me off guard in general, so that was a really pleasant surprise to see. So other than that, let's get on with story 4. Story 4, Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream. So for the plot of story 4, Danny Coughlin is a 36-year-old janitor, always seemed to have bad dreams. However, this newer one felt more realistic than the rest. Danny could even feel the taste of copper coming out from his mouth. What could it all lead to? And so for the first side note, could Danny have some sort of advanced ability of astral projection, almost the same way that somebody's future self revisits them in the past? That's what I'm wondering here, and if you haven't seen the Shining miniseries version from 1997, go watch it. And so continuing on, now with federal investigators Ella Davis and Franklin Gelbert entering the scene, Ella doesn't believe a word of Danny's that is realistic town in Gunner, Kansas is connected now to a woman named Yvonne Wicker. And this really sounds like a Stephen King take on a Final Destination kind of scenario. Instead of a grand design, Danny finds himself in the middle of a reporting of crimes that haven't happened yet. This story is a long one, but it's really well written out. And I have to say, this story and the story Rattlesnakes have really shown themselves to be really absolute amazing experiences as a read. And so continuing on again, having Danny living in a trailer park really makes the presence of these 2 agents, Ella Davis and Frank Gelbert. I also think that Gelbert may have some kind of OCD when he's counting the tiles in his hotel bathroom. Furthermore, counting the towels, it seems as well. I feel like Gelbert may be hiding something. I just don't know what it could be. Could it have been Gelbert framing innocent people for crimes he committed while being a cop? I mean, crooked cop, crooked situation, or a strange situation if you might add that. So again, let's get on to my next side note. Gelbert is looking even more suspicious to me than ever. The counting, the grinding of his teeth on top of the trying to get a larger reaction out of Danny? Or should I just say an emotionally charged false confession? I highly think Gelbert is the killer of Yvonne Wicker, and the cocaine suddenly being in Danny's car is another red flag to me as well. Could have Danny's dream actually have been Danny seeing the aftermath of a crime from Gelbert's eyes, or the true killer's perspective? Kind of in the sight-jacking kind of ability if you played the game Siren on the PS2. I also enjoyed the scenes of Edgar Ball and Danny together. They're just a really solid pair of characters when they are in the scene. It kind of gave me a Breaking Bad kind of vibe, just with their energy between those 2. And I also wrote down the definition of arithmomania, which Gelbert has. It's the abnormal compulsion to count objects or actions and make mathematical calculations. And so, continuing on, page 192, DJ, another favorite side character of mine just for the line she said alone. Again, it's in You Like It Darker, the first edition. Mine's a hardcover, so it was a gift for my girlfriend, so I really appreciate it, sweetie. Thank you. So, yeah, definitely check out page 192. And for the 5th side note, man, chapters 60 to 61 were intense. What's even more frightening, Gelbert is still convinced that Danny did the crime, even though now Danny is in the hospital recovering from an injury in the stomach. I feel like this reveal of information is what sends Gelbert over the edge to take matters into his own hands, no matter what the evidence says. This story to me is the absolute highlight of You Like It Darker. I tell myself I'll read one chapter of this story, but I end up reading 4 in 2.5 hours. Like, I couldn't put it down. It's really that good, and it really highlighted what You Like It Darker had to offer. So for my final thoughts, A great story. Every page had me at the edge of my seat. I really did enjoy the scenes of where Edgar Ball or Ella Davis were talking to Danny about his mysterious visions. This story alone, with some others, is a gigantic reason why you should read You Like It Darker by Stephen King. I think that this story was also inspired by the quote by Booker Taliaferro. A lie doesn't become truth, wrong doesn't become right, and evil doesn't become good just because it's accepted by a majority. And another thing I should add here is that this could have inspired this story is that the effect of the illusion of truth by psychologists, and definitely give that a gander, Google it, or look it up, do some research on it. It's absolutely fascinating. And so, let's get on with story 5, Finn. For the plot of this story, it seems that this Finn Murray person with an I, not a Y, well, I-E and not a Y, has had a rough upbringing growing up, almost like Willie the Weirdo here. Coincidence? From losing his pinky toe from a cherry bomb by a wild party goer next door, to not really enjoying any of the items at the playground except for one giant blue slide he'd call the Twisty. And so for the first side note of this story is that Finn seems to have been born a ton, if with a lot of bad luck, it seems. From the cherry bomb to almost being struck dead by lightning, I mean the lightning struck him down in the back, leaving the back of his hair in a frizzled mess. I really don't know how you'd survive something like that. It was just, I feel really bad for some of these characters. So, to now being mistaken for somebody else by an odd group of people. And so, for my final thoughts on this story is that the story was short and to the point. I don't want to go into too much detail about this story since it's only 22 pages long. I will say I do feel terrible for all the misfortune that was thrown onto Finn Murray at such a young age. This story, to me at least, represents that when you're a teenager, that the world is really stacked against you or is so abhorrently cruel that you shudder to think what's going to happen next. I recommend you read the story or borrow it from your local library or a friend. All in all, it's a very brutal but descriptive story. Story 6, On Slide In Road. So for the plot of Story 6, Donald and Corinne Brown are on a trip to Derry, Maine, visit his dying sister, who is an avid fan of baseball. However, one Billy Brown doesn't seem too thrilled about this trip. And so for the first note, side note here, from the start of this page, this 20-page story, it feels like a more brutal take on a National Lampoon's film, just more chaotic in my eyes. However, I feel like this shortcut won't be an easy one. And I have to say my favorite quote from this story is that they go over a washboard that causes the Buick to shake like a dog after a bath. On Slide In Road, You Like It Darker, page 259. And so for my final thoughts, even though this story was short, it was very enjoyable thrill of a story. Car breaks down in the middle of the woods, leaving a vulnerable family at risk of danger. I really wish this story was a longer novella because I love the banter between Donald and Corinne Brown, which are the grandfather and grandmother of this story in the Brown family, and it's just absolutely hysterical. However, I do feel like Frank Brown, the grandfather's son, just pops in out of nowhere just in the story. It's just like, whoa, dude. Where'd you come from? So let's get on with story 7, Red Screen. An unlucky detective named Wilson is interrogating a man named Leonard Crocker for stabbing his wife, Arlene Crocker. And I have to say my final thoughts on this story is not much to say about this story. However, it feels like a short story built from the novel Cell or the Tommyknockers, which I haven't read Cell yet. Red Screen seems like a supernatural take on seeing red in a blind rage of fury. It's a short 10-page story, but it was very enjoyable like the last one. Well, the previous one, I should say. I still enjoy the fact that these stories have different variations of themes. So with that said, on to Story 8. Story 8, The Turbulence Expert. As Craig Dixon is relaxing, he's gotten a dreaded phone call on what seems to be his day off. It seems a fellow co-worker wants Craig to fly the Allied Airlines Flight 19 from Boston to Sarasota, with no breaks in between. And so, the first side note of this story, the career of a turbulence expert seems that similar of a trucker, always on the move from place to place, with no time to settle down. I feel like that Craig is in a same unlucky predicament like Willie was in the story, or, Finn Murray. So, hopefully it's more grounded though, no pun intended here. So, for side note number 2 of this story, now that Craig has acquainted himself with his aisle companions in the plane, Mary Worth and Frank Freeman, the two of them, one of them's a cranky businessman, Frank, and Mary's just the sweetheart of this story. So, they find out that Craig has a fear of flying. However, was this the cause of the fear? That I do not know. And so for my final thoughts of this story is that it feels like a Stephen King take on the plane scene from Final Destination. If you haven't seen that film, I highly recommend it. This wasn't my favorite story, however, I did enjoy Craig Smith's air of mystery around him and his boss, with the Turbulence Expert being a small, connected group of skilled people. And with that said, on to Story 9. Story 9, Laurie. So for the plot of this story, Lloyd Sunderland has been a widow for 6 months, and things don't seem to be getting better for him. Lloyd's fridge is at a war zone of mold, so on one fateful day, Lloyd's older sister Beth decides to bring him over a little furry 4-legged present. And so for my first side note, I only read the first front and back page of this story, which is 24 pages. I feel like Lloyd may take the dog in, but his older sister seems to be overbearing about it, which I find annoying. But I will say this, read the story for yourself, because I really don't want to spoil any of these stories for you all here. Sorry about that. So, for my final thoughts here, the story was really sweet and intense, and filled with the usual Stephen King suspense, and I did not mean for that to rhyme here. And as I've said with the previous stories, read this one and let me know your thoughts in the comments. For being a 24-page story, it's a very memorable with a very suspenseful attack by nature. Definitely read Laurie when you have the time or make the time even. So let's get on with Story 10. Story 10, Rattlesnakes. So Vic Trenton is staying with his friend Greg Ackerman on the Rattlesnake Keys in Florida. Well, Rattlesnake Road on the Florida Keys. There you go. So, in July and August of 2020, as Vic gets to know his neighbors more, like Allie Bell or Alita Bell, and her kids Jacob and Joseph, who are twins. And so, for my first side note that I wrote down, now, I know this short story is a sequel to Cujo, which I've never read the book, but I've seen the film many years ago. I feel like this story is going to be another tale of grief for Victor Trenton to overcome. The grief of losing his wife Donna in a divorce. And so, for the second side note, the story feels like it's going to be retelling Victor's experience of grief after going through the divorce with his wife Donna. You know, the death of a relationship, a really intimate experience between two people. However, did she pass away sometime after the divorce? I mean, the pain of losing a child is just a soul-crushing and excruciating experience. And man, the reveal on page 339 of this book about the Bell family that happened to the twins in 1982 and 1983. To me, this story is probably going to be on the same uneasiness level as Pet Sematary. However, I noticed that both Allie and Vic both experienced the power of grief at such young ages as adults. I wonder if Henry Bell is alive. And so, continuing on with my notes, this story is also happening during COVID. If the sudden deaths and dangers of rattlesnakes being on the Florida Keys where Vic was staying, the story is showing many different layers of both fear and grief to me, which got me a little choked up at pages 350 and 351. And so, it seems that Vic is looking back at all the deaths he's seen after coming into contact with Mrs. Bell's stroller. It's left outside of the garage by some local teens or something. It was really bone-chilling to having Vic reminisce about Jacob and Joseph's childhoods being punched with the reality of how the twins died in 1982 or 1983, which again was very bone-chilling to me. And so for my final thoughts, if you haven't read Cujo, I say read that first before reading this novella. However, at the same time, the story holds very well on its own. Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream and Rattlesnakes are really strong stories featured in this collection, which I highly recommend you read. So let's get on with story number 11. The Dreamers. So for the plot of story 11, it seems that a grizzled Vietnam War vet is returning home during William Davis's time in Vietnam. He was sometimes a translator, however, as of now he's trying to get back to the swing of things as a regular citizen. So with this job at a place called Tempo, as a stenographer in 1971, something's maybe happening. And so for my first side note, you have to really focus on who's talking and the scenes within this story. But I wonder if Mr. Davis's time in the war will come back to haunt him. Also, is he related to Ella Davis in some way? Please let me know down in the comments below. So, continuing on, outside of William, there's also a gentleman named Elgin, who's a scientist, let me start that over. Outside of William, there's also a gentleman named Elgin, who's a scientist that Davis works for, along with his first patient, Althea Gibson, who is going through a light hypnosis test with Elgin, dealing with some sort of painting with a strange green door, mind you. However, I have a theory that Elgin hypnotized Davis that he was in an emotionless war vet after Vietnam. Furthermore, Davis is the scientist and Elgin is a fraud. This story is only 34 pages long, and that's just a theory in my mind, so if that sounds confusing, I apologize, but that's just what popped into my mind after I got done reading this wonderful story. And so for my final thoughts on this story is not much to say about this story without going into spoilers. However, this feels like a Stephen King take on Beyond the Wall of Sleep by H.P. Lovecraft, with this story does get mentioned in this story of the Dreamers. So the later half of this story was really surprising, and it was nice to see Castle Rock, Maine mentioned after so long. This is yet another story from the book you should definitely give a read. So let's get on with story 12, The Answer Man. So for the plot of story 12, Phil Parker is a successful graduate at Harvard University. However, he's having a hard time leaving the comforts of his little town of Curry. It also seems that there is a feud between the Parker family and the Allburton family, with 2 L's, Burton. Allburton, not 1 L, 2. What other challenges await Phil in this story is my question here. So for my first side note, from reading the first 2 pages, Phil seems to be pressured by his family to become a lawyer in their town of Curry. It was hard enough for Phil to go to Harvard, and the love of his wife Sally Ann going to Vassar University on separate paths of their own lives. Furthermore, who is the Answer Man? Phil's only crossed paths with him 3 times in his life here. And so continuing on with my notes, this story is getting really trippy for a 50-page story from 449 to 499. I'm 480 pages in, and I really don't think the Answer Man is human. More of a projection of Phil's mind, almost like having a way of hearing what you want to hear versus the harsh truth of the world. It kind of personified itself in Phil's presence, just to make him feel good about his life's choices. Just a sort of security blanket, if you will. And so for my final thoughts on this story, great story with a lot of emotional layers to it. I really enjoyed how emotionally raw Phil became after his moments with the Answer Man, even though it was only 3 times. Those 3 moments had a lasting impact on Phil's life. Read the story if you'd like the full experience, and I'm not going to go into spoilers about this story, just definitely go read You Like It Darker. So if this review sounds vague to you all, I apologize, but I really don't want to ruin it for new readers, so let's get on with the Afterword. Afterword. This was a really sweet and wholesome look at Stephen King's career as a writer, from figuring out how he came up with the ideas for Rattlesnakes and Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream boiling down to a what if kind of question that just pops into a person's mind after a morning walk. It's great to see how far Stephen King has come over the years by making this short story collection or novella collection. I really don't know what you'd call it here. From stories he put on hold when he was 30 to then finishing them now at the age of 75. Mr. King has definitely earned his title as a master of his craft. And so my final thoughts and conclusion on this collection: add this collection to your shelf ASAP. With how varied the plots and themes are, along with Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream, Rattlesnakes being the highlight of this story collection, all 12 stories shine in their own way, no pun intended here. At the end of it all, I give You Like It Darker by Stephen King a 10 out of 10. So that's my audio review of You Like It Darker. So thank you all. Please leave a like, comment, subscribe if you enjoy the content on the channel. I'm your host Kite562 of Kite562 Books and Manga Reviews, signing out. And as always, I hope you have a wonderful day, everybody. Later.